Brian of Five Finger Lakes Distilling. I'm Mackenzie of Five Finger.
Just Finger Lakes Distilling.
Well, Finger Lakes, not Five Finger Lakes. Yeah. I was reading along.
I was going to say, that's cool.
Five Finger. Well, I mean, it'd be weird if it was like 3 fingers or 4 fingers. Like, what happened to the rest of them?
How many Finger Lakes are there, Brian?
There's 11. So
There's 11, so it's like a mutant hand.
Yeah.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bourbon Pursuit. And as usual, we got to hit a little bit of the news because we have some shout outs to first give. And I've got to give a shout out to Brad Bonds from Cork and Bottle, who you probably all know by now, that runs the Speakeasy, or where you get all of the vintage and antique bottles at Cork and Bottle up in Northern Kentucky. We got done doing our new riff barrel pick last week, which awesome, by the way. It's a great experience. Good quality stuff that's coming out there too. Really excited to get that. But we had the opportunity to go and sample some old Dusties there, and even one that was a banana cream liqueur from the 1930s from Cuba. So it was pretty interesting. So remember, if you've got old Dusty bottles, give Brad a shout. You can get his number at corkandbottle.com. We also got to go see our good friend Ed Bly while we were there too. So big shout out to him. The other big news that kind of happened this week and kind of shook the bourbon world was that the Heaven Hill 6-year bottled and bond white label that was a Kentucky-only release, the Bottom Shelf Glory, has been announced that it's discontinued. That's it. Heaven Hill's pulling it from the ranks. Not going to be able to find it on store shelves any longer. At least around here in Louisville, it's now down to 1 bottle per person per day. And through the grapevine, I've heard that there's probably less than 1,000 cases remaining at the distributor, so it's gonna go pretty quickly. So if you haven't had a chance yet, call your mules in Kentucky, tell them to go get you a bottle or two and save it, because this $14-15 bottle is gonna be gone relatively soon. However, we kind of talked about new riff barrel picks, and I've got to always be selfish about this because guess what? We're out picking another barrel today. Yeah, getting ourselves a barrel of Knob Creek over at Jim Beam. Really looking forward to doing this. It's always a great experience to be able to do this, as well as bring members of the Patreon community to do it as well. And if you're curious about, well, what barrel picks have been done? Are there any bottles left? Guess what? I went ahead and I made a list of all our barrel picks, and they are up to date on the Patreon site. You can actually click on it. It all mirrors back to a Google sheet, so you can actually see in real time what's available, what's coming, and what bottles are still available. And right now, if you can look at it and it doesn't have a green line through it, then that means there's still bottles available. And well, actually, it probably means that bottles haven't arrived yet, because once they become available, they're going to be gone in about 24 hours. So if you are curious what's out there, what we've done in 2018, which is around, I think, 14, 16, 18 barrels, something around there. It's a lot. And with one more big announcement to come, go and check out patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit. You can see all the barrels that we have done. And then we've got some other things in store for 2019. That planning is going to start relatively soon as well. Also, recently, in another intro, I asked about different ways that people listen or watch this podcast. And this one came from another one of our listeners. He said it's 9:30 p.m. here in Central Florida. He's heading into work to do an inventory count from top to bottom. Long story short, it's a small but growing business, and it never truly had an accurate count. So that's been his big job recently. He'll be there from 10 o'clock p.m. to about 8 a.m. So I'm relying on you guys, Colin Howard, Bill Simmons, and some degenerate NFL gamblers to get me through the night. I work a regular work day and come home for a little nap and heading back in now. So I appreciate the story and being able to understand what you all go through. So if you have interesting ways that you listen to Bourbon Pursuit, please tell us. We'd love to know more. As we had mentioned before, the Kentucky Derby Museum's Legend Series, those tickets are now on sale. Go and check it out, because you've got Michter's, you've got Craft Night, and you've got Dixon of Kentucky Owl that are all be there in the next season, and the first one begins in January. So go get your tickets, derbymuseum.org/legend series. Now, this episode is going to be pretty interesting because it's focused around New York. You know, a lot of the times we look at Kentucky as the bread and butter of where bourbon and rye and everything that we focus on is right here in our backyard. However, there's a lot of things that are happening nationally that are starting to gain a lot of good recognition, and with good reason too. I mean, rye is starting to be put back on the map by companies that are based out of Maryland and Pennsylvania. And now today you're going to learn about Empire Rye. And these are distilleries that are based out of New York that are using New York grains. And it sort of has this bottled and bond feel to it, where a lot of the rules and regulations that they're putting into it really make it something that's truly New York, something that's truly Empire Rye at the end of the day. So I think you're going to really enjoy this episode, because you're going to learn, and hopefully you can go in the area and maybe go pick up a few bottles. Let us know how it is. So make sure that if you do like the podcast, you subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast app or wherever you get it. Or if you like videos, you can go on YouTube or Facebook. And if the show notes are really hard to read on your device, go to bourbonpursuit.com, sign up for our mailing list, and you can get those every Thursday morning. And if you haven't done so yet, go to iTunes and write a damn review. We need them. That's what helps us grow. That's what helps us get found by other bourbon lovers that are out there. So please go take a few minutes to do that. We appreciate it. Whether it's good, bad criticism, doesn't matter. We'll take it. We just love getting feedback from all of our listeners that are out there. Lastly, as we had mentioned, as always, Patreon is how we help build and support this show. So you get cool things like t-shirts, koozies, stickers, barrel picks, access to barrel picks, patreon.com/bourbonpursuit. At least give yourself a minute to go check it out and see if it's worth your time. We really hope it is, because as I said, that's what helped builds this. And this is how we continue to help grow the show to do bigger and better every single week. With that, enjoy this week's episode. And here's Fred Minnick with Above the Char.
I'm Fred Minnick, and this is Above the Char. In the past year, I have been extremely critical of President Trump for his trade policies and how they impact bourbon. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times suggesting he may severely damage the industry, and appeared on NPR, CBS This Morning, CNBC, and many others talking about how his trade policies will really hurt bourbon. See, I spent nearly 10 years studying bourbon trade, dating all the way back to the 1800s, when Germany was buying barrels and shipping them via sailboats to their homeland. I became the leading source speaking about bourbon trade because the distillers didn't want to get on the president's bad side. And hey, I'm proud of the fact I can tell you about the bourbon tariffs in Argentina in the late 1950s. That's 200%, by the way. But in this, I got swept into the political debates that I truly never wanted to be a part of. When people heard my challenges toward Trump's trade policy, they took it as a stance against Republicans and the president, when I was really just speaking to what I believed and using historical anecdotes to make my case. Alas, that message was not clear, and my outspoken nature made a few personal friendships and family relationships quite uncomfortable, and I dare say I made a few enemies along the way. Trump's administration did something I didn't think was possible, and I'm glad they did. Recently, they took NAFTA, tore it up, and did a new deal. The Distilled Spirits Council, the industry's leading national lobby, praised the new deal as it protects the standards and identity of bourbon. So we don't have to worry about that Mexican bourbon I mentioned in the New York Times. And while some retaliatory tariffs are still in the books, I have to give credit where credit is due, and that's to the Trump administration for passing the new deal. But I'd like to say that my stance was never a political one. It was always about bourbon and protecting bourbon. And I don't care who you are, if you threaten bourbon, I'm speaking up. You could say, in this tumultuous political climate, I belong to the modern bourbon party. Do you? And that's this week's Above the Char. Hey, do you have an idea for Above the Char? Ping me on Twitter or Instagram at Fred Minnick. That's at Fred Minnick, Minnick. Until next week, cheers.
Do you ever pour yourself a bourbon, swirl it around, and then start struggling to come up with tasting notes? And perhaps you're also looking for a good Father's Day gift idea. Well, you can now solve both with a kit from Knows Your Bourbon. And unlike other nosing kits on the market, Knows Your Bourbon kits feature real ingredients for the most authentic aromas. You can smell real Tahitian vanilla bean instead of some synthetic aroma that's just made from chemicals. So head on over to knowsyourbourbon.com and enter code BP10 for 10% off your order. Always find what you love at Total Wine & More. With so many great bottles to choose from at the lowest price, it's easy to find your favorite Cabernet or a new single-barrel bourbon to try with some help from one of their friendly guides. And with every bottle comes the confidence of knowing you just found something amazing. With the lowest prices for over 30 years, find what you love and love what you find only at Total Wine & More. Curbside pickup and delivery available in most areas. Visit TotalWine.com to learn more. Spirits not sold in Virginia and North Carolina. Drink responsibly and be 21. From their bar to yours, Chad and Sarah of the popular YouTube channel It's Bourbon Night bring you their favorite at-home old-fashioned mix with the new Elemental Elixir's Golden Hour Syrup. It's a custom-made syrup with notes of bold black tea, warm spices, and orange zest. All you need is your favorite whiskey and ice. No bitters needed. One bottle makes 16 drinks, so that's only $1 a cocktail before you add your own whiskey. They can also be enjoyed in other cocktails or spirits, mocktails, coffee, tea, and anything you can think of. It's crafted locally in Lexington, Kentucky, and you can get your bottle now at whiskeyambitions.com. Ed Bly and Rising Tide Spirits are back again with a new release of Old Stubborn Bourbon. And this release of Old Stubborn is a premium hand marriage of 10, 11, and 12-year cask strength, barely filtered pot still bourbon. It comes in at a staggering 123.8 proof. And the flavoring grain for this one, which the last one was wheated, but this time it's now rye. Rich, sweet, and bold with a long finish that's sure to be another eye-opener. You can order online at Sealbox or thebourbonconcierge.com, and you can even purchase in person at Revival Vintage Spirits, and even now with very few select stores in Kentucky. You can get it now while you can, but be sure to do it because it's not going to last long.
Play Whiskey Wednesday Round 11, the memory game. Until June 26, each week you can win one of our 12 incredible grand prizes. Select $2 at checkout. And if they match on drawing night, you'll win that bottle. Not a match? No worries. You still score a Weller 12-year. Every $5 ticket gives you 5 chances to win, including 4 weekly bonus prizes. Get your tickets now at give270.org. Charitable Gaming License ORG 0002703.
Welcome back to the episode of the Bourbon Pursuit Podcast, the official podcast of bourbon. Just kidding today, but talking about an interesting topic that we have never done before on the show. This was by introduction of Blake from Bourboner, that everybody is pretty familiar with by now as a good standing member of the Bourbon Community Roundtable, runs the popular blog. And this was something he came to me and he said, there's another thing that's happening, and you should probably just get an idea of what's going on in different parts of the country, because, you know, typically this show focuses on the big dogs that are happening in Kentucky. However, there's kind of this conglomerate of distilleries that are getting together up in New York, and they're creating something that's called Empire Rye. And so that's really what we're going to discuss and really look at today is, what is this? What makes it unique? What makes it different? Is it the location? Is it the type of grains? And I think we're going to go really in depth to see really what's making Empire Rye something that's unique to New York, as well as what is going to be hopefully seen as something that you're going to start finding around the nation as well. So with that, let's go ahead and start introducing our guests. So I've got 3 people from representing 3 different distilleries today. So we've got Christopher Williams from Copper Sea Distilling, Alan Katz from New York Distilling, and Brian McKenzie from Finger Lakes Distilling. Fellas, welcome to the show.
Howdy.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
So-
thanks so much.
Absolutely. So I'm very happy to do this. I kind of want to go around the table real quick and let you all introduce each of yourselves, talk a little bit about your distillery, where you're located, favorite flavor of cotton candy, whatever it is that you want to talk about, right? So Brian, you go first.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks again for putting this together. We're happy to be on the show. So Finger Lakes Distilling, that's my company here up on Seneca Lake, kind of right in the heart of Finger Lakes wine country. And we've been in business since 2008. We were one of the first farm distilleries licensed in New York State. New York's a pretty interesting state to do business in because they have really changed some laws that make it an attractive place to do business. I mentioned we're a farm distillery, so we source most all of our ingredients from New York State farms. That's a requirement. And in exchange for that, we have some liberties in the way we can do business. But got into the business, just a big change in career. I was working in the banking industry. I had a transition with that, and just had always been passionate about spirits and how they're made. Being from the Finger Lakes, I thought that a distillery would be a really nice addition to the tourism generated from the wine business and everything. So it was more in line with what I enjoyed, and just thought it would be kind of a cool business for the area. So we got started back in 2008 after a year or two of planning and acquiring our property and equipment and everything. And whiskey has really been something that we've been most passionate about. Although we make 15 different spirits, we do vodkas and gins and liqueurs and everything like that, all from local fruit and grain. But the whiskey has, as I mentioned, been really what we're most passionate about. We make bourbon, we make rye, we make some single malt that we haven't even released yet. And the rye was really something that we got into right away. Basically, just decided that was a hot spirit in the market, and something that we enjoy drinking. So we started to make the rye back in 2008 and released our first batch. I think it was at Whiskey Fest in 2010. And it's really been our best selling product since then. So when the idea came along for Empire Rye, it was definitely something we wanted to be part of. And I think it's going to be a great project for all of us.
Well, awesome. We'll definitely dive into that a little bit more. That was a great introduction. So Chris, I'll let you go next.
Yeah, I'm Christopher Williams. I'm the chief distiller at Copper Sea Distilling. We've been distilling in the Hudson Valley of New York since, we started the company in 2011 and we're fully licensed by early 2012 and started producing then. And we also take advantage of the New York Farm Distillery License Class and the ample benefits that we get from that license class, which requires a distillery to use a minimum of 75% New York State grown grain, agricultural product, depending on what you're making. If you're making whiskey, obviously it's predominantly going to be about grain. And our philosophy was actually always to do that. Actually, our goal was to use, and what we do is use 100% Hudson Valley grain specifically. Our approach at Copper Sea is something we call heritage methods distilling, just sort of our catch-all term for creating whiskey with the provenance of our locale, which is the Hudson Valley. So all of our grains coming from either our farm. We have a 75-acre certified organic farm in New Paltz in Ulster County. And we also use, what we call heritage methods. That includes things like simple direct-fired copper pot stills. So literally, an actual fire under the pot in the manner that whiskey was made in the, early in the 19th century, 18th century in the region. We do all of our own malting in-house on the floor of the distillery in the traditional manner. So all the malt from our whiskey is coming from our malt house. In the case of our bourbon, which is called Excelsior Bourbon, we actually even started our own cooperage with a partner several years ago to source oak, New York American white oak in state and have it coopered into barrel. So our approach is it's intensely nerdy, very hands-on, and we're not steampunks or anything. I don't come to work in period dress, but we try to keep it in the spirit. What I say in the spirit of 19th century farm distilleries in the region.
Well, that's awesome. And I also want to say, Chris, thanks for coming on today, because I know you're yelling at kids or something this week and you almost lost your voice. Was that what it was?
Well, it's probably a combination of yelling at kids. I don't have to yell at my kids that much, but kids are just, they're awful vectors. They're worse than ticks. They're full of diseases all the time. So I'm riddled with them, and I have 3 kids. So it's pretty much a nonstop.
Right. I know the feeling all too well. Not with 3, but just being constant sick or something that's always going around at daycare or anything like that. So I know how that is. So Alan, go ahead.
So I'm with New York Distilling Company, and we've been open since late 2011, and in listening to the guys describe their history and business, we're somewhere in between. We're an urban distillery based in Williamsburg and Brooklyn. We're not farmers, but we also have the Class D farm distiller's license. We make gin and rye whiskey. And from a personal standpoint, my background came from environment of bars, restaurant bars, and bartending. And our outlook when we got started was focusing on spirits that we could lay claim to as, if you will, purposefully different, something that was unique, but not so esoteric. And where we ended up was a focus on gin and rye with a look backward to, if you will, the first golden age of cocktail culture in the mid to late 19th century up until Prohibition, and a little bit more forward thinking as well to see how the rediscovery of those spirits specifically has taken place now in what many, myself included, would call the second golden age of cocktail culture, particularly in places like New York, and not just New York City, but around New York State, through the Mid-Atlantic, California, internationally now, and participating in this rejuvenation and renewed celebration of spirits that heretofore were really unknown. And in the context of whiskey, as much as I love bourbon, I love drinking bourbon. We sell a lot of bourbon at our bar attached to the distillery, but we only make rye whiskey and want to celebrate that as part of the cultural heritage of New York in many ways, first and foremost, but also as a resolute American spirit, and try and put our own take primarily vis-a-vis the grains that we're growing in partnership with one primary farmer up near Brian's neck of the woods near Seneca Lake, and how we can treat these grains in a wine context as people would look at grapes, and how you might stress the bunches of grapes or the vines that are growing the grapes to produce the most concentrated flavor by pruning, by developing, in some cases, by creating hybrids. And that's what our focus is on. And I think just like Brian and Chris, this is a game, if you will, of great passion, but also great patience. And so while we've all been doing this for several years, I think we feel similarly. We're just on the precipice. While we've been making this whiskey now for 6 years going on, we're just at the point now where we feel like we have enough of an inventory that we can pick and choose from, learn enough about the whiskey we've produced and have been aging to start releasing it in not only interesting quantities, but interesting profiles that we feel we can replicate and offer up to the public.
That's awesome. So there's one thing that Chris had mentioned I thought was interesting about the oak that you guys are using as well. I mean, are you guys sourcing barrels from independent stave, or is it something that's local that is in the area? Like, what's your all's barrel situation like?
Well, my specific barrel situation, for the most part, I source most of my oak from Kelvin Cooperage. The only exception that I had mentioned there, our bourbon is aged in 100% New York oak from a cooperage we co-developed up in the Adirondack several years ago. So that was the reference I was making to New York oak specifically. Gotcha.
Yeah, I found that interesting. I didn't think I've heard of New York oak before, so that was a new one. Which I don't really know if like the oak in different parts of the country really affected, because honestly, I haven't talked to a lot of the cooperages around here to kind of see if where they're sourcing the trees from are really affecting it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic and very timely. I was at a conference on Friday about the terroir. I'm not sure this was the right term to describe it, but the terroir of New York State. And obviously, New York State geographically is very large. You're going to have microclimates within the state. The biology in different parts of the state is going to be considerably different. But if you just use that for ease of sake as a catch-all, I have no doubt that oak would contribute to terroir. The oak that grows here is going to be different than the oak that grows in Missouri or other parts of the country. For the time being, we're using barrels primarily from independent stave and from Kelvin. And for us, it's just about a learning process. It's also, very honestly, about the economics of it and how we can buy barrels at our scale in bulk. Our first year distilling rye, 6 years ago, I don't think we filled much more than 22 barrels, and we're only using 53-gallon barrels for our products. But last year, we filled just shy of 1,000 barrels. And so at a certain point, that economy of scale is real dollars and real figures. in trying to keep the waterline under our chin.
Absolutely.
At best.
What I can say about, I strongly believe that oak does have a significant part to play in the terroir aspect or the provenance aspect of a whiskey. We actually only use it for our bourbon, and that was a point that what part of it is the availability of New York oak and our ability to have it coopered in the quantities that we need. But bourbon, I think, as opposed to rye, really is fundamentally about the oak, and we can start to talk about the distinctions between these two categories, these spirits. But bourbon, coming from bourbon is a spirit that at its base is 51% corn. Corn, and to my opinion, there's not a lot of there. A high corn-based spirit. I think corn is, it has a flavor, but it's fairly mild. That's why we have the flavoring grains in bourbon, whether it's rye or wheat for wheated bourbons, to kind of add a little dimension there to the mash bill, to the flavor of the grain. But I think this is out of Buffalo Trace's own Warehouse X experiments. I think we've learned that now up to 75% of the flavor of a bourbon is coming from the oak it's aged in. So for us making a New York bourbon, it was very important to have New York oak. As opposed to the rye, rye is just a very aggressive grain in a whiskey. It's very present. You're drinking rye. You're drinking a high rye bourbon, for that matter. And it wasn't as fundamental for us to use New York oak for that in terms of the provenance aspect. Absolutely.
And I guess one question to kind of tag along with their kind of question that rolled in is, you had mentioned, Alan, with the microclimates. I mean, is there a difference in the way the barrel is constructed for aging in New York versus somewhere else, whether it needs to be thicker or less thin or anything like that? Do you have any idea?
I don't have an idea, but if I had to surmise, I would say that there isn't. There's a standard stave width. You can find different things depending on the size of the barrel, particularly in our cases, at least for now, for fun, we look at larger casks, larger butts like sherry butts that we might put a secondary age for experimentation at this point. But for the most part, it's a standard, and if we just look in this country, although, the microclimates are going to play a part over time, even between, say, Kentucky and Tennessee and New York, the variation in climate today is not that different. Very generally, they have a longer summer. We have a slightly longer winter. But, if you're talking about years of aging, a lot of that will even out. But I do think that the oak is, as Christopher was saying, certainly that's an experiment that I would find worthwhile, because I do think there will be something distinctively unique. The same as the grains. I mean, that's part of our experimentation, whether it's with our own whiskeys individually or Empire Rye as a category, is to see in time if there's something not unique, perhaps, to discerning a terroir from rye grown in the middle of the state or upstate New York.
Right. Well, I think we're getting a little off track. So let's kind of take it back to the rye here. So there was, Alan, you had also said something else, and maybe this is something to kind of talk about before we go into the idea behind Empire Rye, is you had mentioned the culture of rye with inside of New York. And perhaps I don't know the history behind it. Maybe you all can enlighten me and as well as the listeners of what is the culture of rye in New York and the history behind it.
Well, there's two different things. There's the drinking of rye and there's the production of rye. And certainly the production of rye in its most faceted format, certainly comes a little bit more concertedly out of the Mid-Atlantic. The most notorious rye distiller going back to the late 18th century was George Washington. And while that was something for easy consumption, certainly more healthy than drinking water at the time, what grew out of alcohol usage, by and large, and some American cultural sensibility was cocktails. And New York City and places even like Buffalo and St. Louis and New Orleans and San Francisco really gave rise to this sensibility of American cocktail culture. And if you go back to the earliest cocktail books from the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, the brown spirit of choice, not ubiquitously, but far outpacing any other American spirit, such as bourbon, was rye whiskey. And so I think that's certainly part of the fascination, and in some way, a reclamation on our part, whether we're drinking it or from the standpoint of the three of us, distilling it and making rye whiskey specifically is in part reclaiming that sensibility of American gastronomic culture and applying it, certainly in our case, to how people might have considered rye once upon a time and how they might certainly today or in the future.
I think it's important to note that there is a strong history of rye production in New York State too. People think of Pennsylvania, Maryland, but back in the mid to late 19th century, there was a ton of rye produced in this state. And, I think that's part of the reason we're really excited about this project is we're kind of going back, to a product that was we were really known for. And I know Christopher's done a lot of research about the history of distilling in New York. He can probably comment more on that kind of topic, but there is a strong history there.
Well, I'll try not to overburden this with the finer points of the arcane history of New York distilling, but yeah, I mean, we do. We have a rich history in this state. As I was researching it years ago to develop a couple of talks that I will sometimes deliver if pressed, it made me very sad to realize what Prohibition really did to the culture of distilling in the Northeast and in New York specifically. There were whole styles and methodologies, brands that were richly conceived and being developed that, would, if not for Prohibition, would probably be right up there with brands like Jim Beam or Old Forester today. Like they would be on par. We'd be looking at those almost as ubiquitously as we see on the shelf these big storied brands out of Kentucky, and that's just the way the cards fell after Prohibition. Those Kentucky distilleries, for whatever reason, they had maintained their infrastructure, whether it was government contracts and all that sort of stuff. That just didn't happen in the Northeast. Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, those were the big rye producing states. They just didn't rebound. And at that point, bourbon became king and rye was consigned to the dustbin of American, drinking history. And so, yeah, it's very exciting to be with this group of, excited, interested distillers who, really see the potential to reclaim that heritage for the state.
And so I guess that's a good segue into the idea of Empire Rye. So I kind of want to just, whoever wants to take it, like who is the idea or who kind of started figuring out like, okay, let's band some people together. Let's figure out what this looks like. Is it a common recipe among everyone? Like, so what is the idea of Empire Rye? Whoever wants to take it.
Well, I think it was utterly a joint effort of initially 6 distilleries and then another distillery by chance after we had come up with the basic concept, we found out had actually made a conforming whiskey without even knowing it. And so they were included later. And the initial distilleries were Coppersea Distilling, Finger Lakes Distilling, New York Distilling Company, Tuttletown Spirits, which produces Hudson whiskey, Black Button Distilling up in Buffalo. I think I said to say Kings
Rochester.
County. In Rochester, and then Kings County Distilling, also in Brooklyn. So what was awesome is that we kind of found each other and talked about it periodically over the course of a couple of years as this like pie in the sky idea. We should develop this style of whiskey. We should make a whiskey style for New York State. Won't that be cool? And then we all kind of, went back home and went about our business and forgot about it. So I think I was probably just the most initially excited by this.
You absolutely were.
So if in the history of Empire Rye, I think I could be the John Adams. I was just the guy who wouldn't shut up about it. And just kept on telling everybody, we should do this until finally, if for no other reason than to get me to stop asking, we all finally came together about 3 years ago this month. And over the course of about a month, the group of 6 hammered out, debated, and I think we went through 6 drafts, what the requirements to be called Empire Rye would be.
And so let's dive into that. So if Brian or Alan want to take over, what is, when you start looking at this drafting process, what were those elements that you were looking at to be considered something that is an Empire Rye?
We obviously wanted to focus in on utilizing New York State agricultural product with this. So we set the minimum of 75% New York State rye to be used. We wanted to also kind of distinguish with some proof. So we're trying to balance out the some of the federal requirements for rye with also making it a bit distinctive for New York State. So we set a barrel proof maximum of 115, which I think maybe leads to some different flavor profiles in that regard. We also put a 2-year age requirement on it, so all the Empire Ryes would be regarded as straight whiskeys. And I think that covered most of it. Beyond that, we left a lot of room for experimentation. Whether you wanted to utilize malted rye, other grains, flavoring grains for your mash bill, but the 75% is really an important component of it, being New York State rye.
And if you're considering this a New York State rye, an Empire Rye, is the grain source, are you primarily saying like you need to source all your grains from New York, or is it saying, at this point you can kind of take it anywhere? I mean, if you want to say that somebody in Tennessee wants to produce an Empire Rye, like, is that a possibility?
I believe we did specify that it has to be produced in New York State.
What about the grain sourcing? I mean, is that something that you have to get something that is from localized farmers, or is that something that's just kind of like, it's a little gray area wherever you can get your grains?
Well, there's some flexibility with the remaining 25%, but the 75% rye has to be grown in New York.
And so some of you have that ability to be able to source it locally at your own farms. Some of you are getting it from other places. One thing that was kind of interesting, you said a barrel proof max of 115, which is pretty unique because it seems a little, in my opinion, a little low, right? I mean, some of them are up to, at least sometimes when you dump them in barrels, it's 160 proof and stuff like that. So why the low proof on the rye whiskey for the barrel proof max?
Well, if you look at the historical, from a historical perspective, going in at 100 proof, 100 to 105 proof was actually industry standard for even bourbon distilleries prior to Prohibition. The 125 proof max that's set by the federal government, I don't necessarily know exactly how that was arrived at. Ultimately, I would expect that a decent amount of pressure from the industry probably pushed it up that high. You get different flavors from the barrel. There are water-soluble compounds and ethanol-soluble compounds that you extract from the oak. So those are going to give you different flavors depending on what proof you go in at. So pre-Prohibition whiskeys would have been known for having flavors that were a little different than what we think of as bourbon or rye today that go in at those high proofs. The other thing that happens when you go in at a low proof is the same time you're aging your whiskey, your ethanol, you're simultaneously aging the water for that whole period of time. So, for example, if you were to go in at 125, the industry max, and then bottle at 80 proof, which is the standard sort of bottle proof that you can expect on a shelf, that means that you have to get from 125 proof out of the barrel all the way down to 80 proof with the addition of flavorless water. Right out of the tap or right through your filter, as opposed to, I go in at Copper Sea, we go in at 105 across the board for all our whiskeys, and I bottle proof to 96. So that's a significantly lower volume of flavorless water than I'm adding to my finished whiskey, which means there's a lot more flavor in that bottle.
Mm-hmm. Alan, any other comments on the?
I think it's the easiest term I can use is it's a very interesting hedge. Again, when you're talking about something that, as Christopher said, started about 3 years ago, you're putting whiskey in barrels, and in some ways, it's not going to be bad, but you're crossing your fingers to see how interesting it might be. Anecdotally, from our experience, our original fantasy, if you will, was we're going to make American rye. It's going to be a straight rye whiskey. And at 2 years, we took our whiskey out of the barrel. These were barrels that we had put in at 125, frankly, of our original mash bill at 72% rye. And it wasn't bad. It just wasn't that interesting. And so we let it go another year. And that was sort of the magic dynamic for us. And where we were aging our barrels was a minimum of 3 years. And so henceforth, we don't really release anything less than that. What I find, at the 115 that we find very interesting is, as Christopher's saying too, is the flavor components can be astoundingly different. And some of the rationale, I assume, I don't know this factually, but I assume that the federal government ultimately went to 125 is, again, the profit in alcohol is not in the booze itself. It's in water. Once upon a time, there weren't a lot of 80 proof spirits that were higher, just the way the three of us are putting out spirits at higher bottling proofs today. But as it came down, and as you get conglomerates and companies that grow, and perhaps if they're public companies, they really have to look at every detail and how it affects the bottom line. And at 80 proof, you could say across any number of spirits, not just whiskey or rye specifically, that you're trying to find some modicum where you still taste the essence of that spirit, but you can get as much profit out of it as possible. So I very much appreciate Christopher's angle on this, where the less water we have to add after aging, the more retention there is of the authentic flavor. Again, perhaps we'll know in time the authentic terroir of what we're not only growing, but distilling and aging.
And so the other thing was kind of talking about the 2 year age minimum too. As everybody knows, that is the definition for being, at least the age for being a straight, assuming that you guys are not adding any flavors or additives that falls within that 2.5% range as well. It's just a given. But the other thing is when you taste a whiskey that is a 2 year rye versus say like a 2 year bourbon, it seems like a rye whiskey is able to develop a lot more flavors. It's able to almost mature a lot faster than a bourbon at a 2, 3, or even 4 year range. Do you all agree or disagree with that?
Shopify's already taken the cash register online, helping millions sell billions around the world. But did you know that Shopify can do the same thing at your retail store? Give your point of sale system a serious upgrade with Shopify. Shopify's point of sale is your command center for your retail store. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify has everything you need to sell in person. And with Shopify, you get a powerhouse selling partner that effortlessly unites your in-person and online sales into one source of truth. Track every sale across your business in one place and know exactly what's in stock. Connect with customers in-line and online. Shopify helps you drive store traffic with plug-and-play tools built for marketing campaigns, from TikTok to Instagram and beyond. And get hardware that fits your business. Take payments by smartphone. Transform your tablet into a point-of-sale system, or use Shopify's point-of-sale Go mobile device for a battle-tested solution. Plus, Shopify's award-winning 24/7 help is there to support your success every step of the way. Do retail right with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/bourbon, all lowercase, and go to shopify.com/bourbon to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/bourbon. If you're anything like me, then you can't get enough about bourbon. And that's why I'm a subscriber to Bourbon Plus magazine. Bourbon Plus is a quarterly publication that tells the stories from the heart of bourbon, the farmers who grow the grain, the distillers who labor over the process, and the people like you and me who raise their glasses to celebrate it all. Subscribe to Bourbon Plus magazine today at bourbonplus.com, that's PLUS.com, and use code PURSUIT at checkout for $5 off your subscription.
But the other thing is when you taste a whiskey that is a 2 year rye versus say like a 2 year bourbon, it seems like a rye whiskey is able to develop a lot more flavors. It's able to almost mature a lot faster than a bourbon at a 2, 3, or even 4 year range. Do you all agree or disagree with that?
I agree. I feel like not only that, I think you start to lose some of the the characteristics of rye whiskey as you age it further. Some of that kind of nice spicy note. We actually age our whiskeys. We continue to release our rye in the 3 to 4 year range, even though we had some older whiskey. Just because we prefer the flavor components there, whereas the bourbon I think does require a little more time in the barrel.
I think it also goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier about bourbon really fundamentally being about the oak. The longer you're putting a relatively mild substrate, corn based liquor into a barrel, the higher the dividends are going to be. Whereas rye, unaged rye, which frankly would have been a common tipple all the way from 1776 when we stopped drinking rum and started making rye in the Northeast because that was what we could make from our homemade, our homegrown grain. Even up to the early 20th century, unaged rye would have been a fairly common drink in this region. And the reason is because rye just has a lot of flavor out of the gate.
For us, again, it depends what you want to do with the finished whiskey. Whether for us, starting at 72 and then moving to a 75% rye component in our mash bill, we're still very attuned to how our whiskey is going to be used in very standard cocktails, Manhattans, old fashions, whiskey sours. And the one other factor, whether it's bourbon or rye, that we find is we're not at a point where we can really assess whether we're over-aging. I don't think we're there yet personally. But between 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, et cetera, and those still what we are at our point feel like are early days, aside from the interaction with the oak, is we're getting annual evaporation. We're losing about 5% a year to evaporation, about 5% just in the first couple of months to absorption. And we are allowing for a significant amount of concentration of flavors, I believe, year over year. And for us at New York Distilling, really digging into trying to find some of the unique fruit flavors associated with a higher profile rye has been really fascinating, particularly working with a few different varieties of rye itself, where some will produce over, really between 3, 4, and 5 years, a lot of darker cherry flavors or sort of the fleshier, pinkish peach flavors more than the yellow peach flavors. We've got a couple varieties, one a fun antique variety called Horton Rye, which dates back a couple centuries in its original incarnation as a rye from New York State that are really producing tropical notes, pineapple, mango, really fascinating, but it's a much shorter grain stalk than the typical ryes that we've been able to obtain from different farmers in New York. So time it can be different things. Obviously, interaction with wood, but I think the evaporation and its influence on concentration of flavors is uniquely significant as well.
That's interesting talk about the, at least with the rye portion of it. There's also something that I noticed when I was looking at EmpireRye.com and looking at the standards that has been sort of set forth. And, Brian, you had mentioned that, 25% of the mash bill can be composed of any raw or malted grain. And what's some of the things that you all are experimenting with that other kind of 25%? Maybe you guys are giving away some secrets, between your distilleries, or you don't want to say it or not, but give some ideas of kind of what are those other grains that you're looking at doing?
Yeah, I think that's one thing amongst this group. I think people really like to be transparent about what we're doing. So nobody's really super secretive in this organization, but
let all your secrets out there.
Our existing Mackenzie Rye is actually conformed to the standards of Empire Rye. So we just stuck with what we were doing, which is 80% rye, 20% malted barley. We did do a special release of a barrel that we put up when we actually kind of finalized the plan for Empire Rye. But I think some of the group took liberties with obviously using some corn in their mash bills. I believe Christopher did a significant portion of malted rye, or maybe even 100% malted rye. Yeah. So I mean, like I said before, there was a ton of flexibility for how you create your Empire Rye. We just wanted to put some, guidelines in, so there's some underlying characteristic that everybody can kind of get their head around when they think of Empire Rye.
Yeah, in much the same way that bourbon has a huge amount of flexibility in terms of what you can call a bourbon. Obviously, there's a sort of a baseline standard understanding that a lot of people kind of stick to. But I see this a lot more also in the craft space. You see things like one of our other Empire Rye colleagues, Kings County Distilling. They make a bourbon that includes peated barley, malted barley that's peated. So and there's no rule that says you can't do that. The other standards of bourbon are conformed to, but there's all this room to play. So we wanted to make sure that the requirements allowed us to put our personality, our distillery's personality and methodologies into the mix, while also having some clear-cut process and ingredient requirements that would allow, upon, for example, a tasting flight, what do you call it? A vertical tasting, a horizontal tasting, whatever, some kind of directional tasting, would allow you to try to sense these commonalities. Like, what is the thread of the style that you can follow through all of these different expressions? I mean, that's really where the fun comes in. And we've already got bars in New York City that have Empire Rye flights on the menu, and people are really excited about that, to be able to follow the progression of this concept.
And so what are those other things that you're experimenting with, Chris? I mean, I know you said the 100% malted barley, but what are those other kind of grains?
Malted rye, So we, our main, some of us have gone in whole hog. I'd say the three distilleries you're talking to here have made a very strong commitment right out of the gate to the concept. Some of the other distilleries are, they already have another rye that they're very proud of, and rightly so. And then they're stacking the Empire Rye compliant stuff into their mix. We did ours is called Bonnecue Crag Straight Rye Malt, and it's 100% malted rye. I've also started laying down a second mash bill for sort of a single barrel concept down the road, and that's a little bit more like a standard rye, so more like that sort of 80-20 sort of malt, rye to malted barley kind of mash bill. But we'll play around. This also gives us the opportunity to play around with different barrel finishes if we want. There's even a provision in the Empire Rye standards to create a blended Empire Rye, so groups of us can actually get together and combine to come up with something that's maybe a little more complex than the sum of its parts.
You were going to steal one of my next questions, so thanks for doing that.
I think Alan had something to say before
It was like we're jumping the horse there. Yeah, go ahead, Alan. I kind of want to hear what you guys are doing.
Just for comparison, we're I would say fairly standardized. Our mash bill is 75 rye and 13 corn, 12% malted barley, and we stuck to that over the last couple of years since this has been institutionalized, if you will. And our effort probably will be more focused on aging and seeing how far we can take it into some sense of significant aging and probably also secondary barrel finishes, to the point, in fact, that our initial Empire Rye offering is actually a product with a secondary barrel finish. Actually, it goes from our once used 2-year rye to a once used Applejack barrel, straight Applejack barrel, to give it just a little bit of that unique quality finish to it. But for us, we're so enthusiastic. We basically converted our entire methodology over to our Empire Rye recipe or mash bill, and I would think it's a really exciting possibility. Obviously, not just for the diversity of products that are going to come out of our colleagues in New York State, but also how we, if you will, export it through marketing, whether domestically or internationally. I think the interest is so enthusiastic for rye as a category that this is going to be a very unique and celebrated subcategory within American rye whiskey.
And so when I was looking at the standards as well. I think whoever when you all are crafting this up, I think that you probably had the bottled and bond rules like on the side of it. And you're looking at here and then looking at here and trying to do some comparisons, because there's also something that we hadn't mentioned or talked about in saying that this has to be mashed, fermented, distilled, barreled, and aged at a single New York State distillery in a single distilling season, right? So it sounds very synonymous what's happening with bottled and bond. Was there some of that commonality that you were really shooting for within those laws and regalities? Whoever wants to take it.
I think that so it was a really fun debate and conversation when we came up with these rules. And I actually think it was Ralph Lorenzo from Tuttletown Spirits. We were talking about how do we ensure that there's how do we ensure the sanctity, so to speak, of the concept, so that it doesn't get co-opted if it is successful, which it will be. And so we were talking about, these different provisions that we would include. And Ralph Lorenzo said, why don't we just include the language of the Bottled and Bond Act in our provision? Because it's basically a vetted rubric for ensuring craft. The people don't really think about this, but the Bottled and Bond Act was basically the craft debate well before the craft distilling movement even started. Before Prohibition even was underway, this debate was already happening. There was this battle between rectifiers and actual distilleries, and the actual distilleries went to the federal government and said, we need some kind of provision that creates a reassurance in the marketplace to the buyer that what they're getting was actually produced by the distillery in question and is a product that is not going to make the marketplace lose faith in the industry. And so that's what the Bottled and Bond Act was. So we kind of looked at it and we're like, well, that's exactly what we're trying to accomplish anyway. And it also had the added benefit of making it so that in order to conform to the Empire Rye standard, you would inherently have to be making a whiskey that could be bottled as a bottled and bond product if you chose to do so. So basically, any Empire Rye compliant whiskey, once it reaches 4 years old, if the distiller chooses to do so, can offer it as a bottled and bond product.
That's certainly in our plans.
Yeah, I was going to say, Alan, you kind of had something you wanted to add there. It seemed like.
No, that Christopher makes the point very clearly. That's certainly in our plans, is to have that option. We're a year away from having that that meets all qualifications, including the age statement and the mash bill minimums. So we'll see how it tastes. And it might be a 4-year bottle and bond, or maybe it needs to be a 5-year bottle and bond. But for us at this point, as long as we sort of hold the reins here and keep things under control, I think we all want to be able to have flavor rule the day and have something that's interesting and uniquely our own, but also that can, if you will, be traced back or attributable to the qualities of what we perceive to be the influences of growing the grains and aging them here in New York.
And so there was actually a question that came in from Frank Mitlick. He's watching this and he said, who's actually enforcing this standard? If you look at it and you kind of look at it and you say, okay, we can get a bunch of distilleries on, and then, yeah, sure, maybe, hopefully, they're all in it for the right reasons. They're not just taking the Empire name and slapping a label on it. But instead, is there anybody that is enforcing the standard, or is it just a bond of trust really amongst everybody right now?
Well, the plan is to have a group that will enforce, that make sure that people are adhering to the criteria. We've also, gone down the road with trademark protection and that kind of thing. But I think it's only as good as the strength of the actual criteria. So if I think it's going to be really important that we do enforce all that as the mark becomes more common.
One of the sort of, and I don't even know that we really intended this, it just kind of happened this way, the 75% New York State grown rye requirement. So many of us, pretty much all of the producers of Empire Rye, and most of the whiskey producers in New York State have the farm distillery license class, and that's usually what they're producing their rye under. Now, that license class requires that you be using a minimum of 75% New York State grown product, period. So the Empire Rye designation requires that 75% be New York State grown rye. So in a way, the state's enforcement already kind of covers that aspect of it. We have to be using 75% New York State grown product anyway to maintain our license class. So that 75% has to be rye is a fairly simple ask, since most of us are doing that anyway. It's almost not an issue. The other things like barrel proof, that it actually be made at a New York State distillery, a lot of these things are, the barrel proof stuff. I mean, that's going to be in your records for the TTB. So, a lot of it's honor system at this point. I think most of us are so invested in trying to make sure that this concept be well regarded in the marketplace.
Absolutely.
There's not a lot of concern that anybody's, nobody's going and checking anybody's distillery. There's no inspector general or major domo going around and making sure that, doing surprise inspections. It's mostly, and like Brian said, I think in New York, we have a kind of a pride in being fairly transparent. We're all very committed to making sure that the state's, distilling landscape is respected, that brand of New York State spirits in general is one that people will be proud of and that will have weight in the marketplace. So.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a paper trail too, right? You had mentioned that you guys are probably all very well connected. If you're sourcing the rye from somebody else, I'm sure that you'll be able to go back and be able to see like, oh yeah, well, they just got it from there, right? So there's probably no need for, as you said, inspector general or checks and balances between everybody, because I'm sure you got plenty of work to do yourselves. So another question is, when you come down to the actual bottling of it, right? I mean, I had known that, Chris, I think you had mentioned 96 proof is what you all do. I mean, is there a proof, or is that part of something that is very, experimental, weighted amongst your own brands? Is anybody doing barrel proof yet? Like, what's kind of your all's ideas around there too?
I'd say it's weighted, individually for the brands. For us, while our mainstay Ragtime Rye, which in the future will be a legitimate Empire Rye, is not today, because the mash bill we currently have available doesn't quite meet the requirements. We bottle that at 90.4. When we get to having our Ragtime Rye Empire Rye, it'll probably be at 90.4. The offering we have today with the Applejack barrel finish, we experimented with in several places, but really loved it at 100 proof, which frankly might be another bottle and bond candidate down the road. But it was all, that's really the pleasure of it in many ways, is the experimentation of seeing if you got a product that you feel is ready for public consumption, is ready for the real world, and experimenting with where you might offer it, whether it's on its own, neat, on the rocks, again, in a cocktail, which, again, by history, I think a lot of rye whiskey, also because it has that little bit of more forward edge to it through rye, through the spice of rye, that it's really a component that goes great in cocktails. So you want it to be able to still stand out with other modifiers.
Mm-hmm. Brian or Chris, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that bottle proof is just, it's one of those things where that's open-ended. We go in at 96, and that's largely a practical matter. I believe, for the most part, a little bit of water should be added to a spirit, whole and distilled water, just to give it. Because remember, when you're distilling, you're creating, distilled ethanol and distilled water. I think a little minerality added back into the whiskey gives it just a little something for the mouthfeel, a little something to bounce those flavors off of. We go in at 96 to the bottle, mostly just because that's just above. We don't chill filter at Copper Sea, and we also don't use. We use very simple direct fired copper pot stills, so we produce a very oily whiskey. And anything, I think it's 95.3 is the threshold where a non-chill filtered whiskey will actually, below that, it'll throw chill haze. It'll loosh up in the bottle if you get the bottle cold. So, in a cold liquor store, a very oily whiskey will actually like just turn into a glob, like a cloudy glob in the bottle. So that's why we go in at 96.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's just important to leave that at the discretion of the distiller. We like our whiskey at 91 proof, our Mackenzie Rye. We'll be branding that with the Empire mark. But when we did the release, we wanted to show people what it tasted like at cask strength, and before we put a sherry finish on it. So we did a single barrel at our Empire Rye event that we did this past fall, and that was at cask strength.
And so one other thing Chris hinted at was that there's another thing with inside the standards that's saying that a blended whiskey containing no less than 100% of qualifying Empire Rye whiskeys from multiple distilleries may still be called a blended Empire Rye. So are you all looking at doing collaborations, or is there a day when you're going to think that, oh, we've got too many barrels and now we can sell some, and then some people can go and create their own sourced version of Empire Rye? So kind of give your thoughts on that.
All of the above. Watch this space,
right?
I think that. So I think we want to elevate this concept. I think that there's a great strength in categorical distinctions. So all of us out here, a few of us make a bunch of different things. Some of us make other expressions of whiskey. Some of us make other non-whiskey spirits, but at the same time, we see there is a value to Kentucky bourbon. Okay, I make a bourbon. Brian makes a bourbon, but people still have this very rightly associated reverence for a style that was born and raised in Kentucky. They have a very clear idea of what Tennessee whiskey is, what single malt Scotch is, what single pot still Irish whiskey is. So creating strength through category is a time-tested strategy for getting attention and respect for what you're doing. So all of us kind of making a single thing is one great thing, but it also just brings attention to New York rye in general, and New York spirits in general. And to whatever extent we can do that, this is a success. But certainly if, 5 or 10 years from now, there's a thriving blended rye whiskey, blended Empire Rye whiskey industry going, and you've got people. Exactly. Maybe there one day, maybe there will just be a Johnny Walker of Empire Rye, somebody who doesn't necessarily have a distillery, but who creates a strong brand by contracting and sourcing with all of us for our versions of Empire Rye to create a distinctive product in their own right. That'd be pretty dope.
You heard it here first. If you want to get in the ground floor, here's your opportunity. Right?
What he said.
And so I kind of want to wrap it up a little bit of kind of talking about the growth of where this is going to go, because, looking at the website right now at Empire Rye, you've got another 7 distilleries that are also going to be committing to developing and creating an Empire Rye. It looks like a lot of the expected release dates around fall of 2019. Where do you kind of go? Do you kind of see a lot of the New York distilleries all jumping on board with this, and what's kind of the next phase of it?
There's been, tremendous interest in it amongst the distilling community in New York. We've got, I think we're second or third in the country in terms of number of distilleries now. And, people are quickly jumping on board to make their version of Empire Rye. So I think it's only going to, grow over the next few years.
Some of the logical opportunities, we got, again, such a broad state from an agricultural standpoint, from an urban standpoint here in New York City. There's great opportunities just to taste people on this varied products within one subset category of Empire Rye. And so I think the more opportunities that we can give them and the more products that are available just create greater enthusiasm. As a group, we did launch New York Rye Week last year. We'll be hosting that again, certainly in Brooklyn and New York City, and maybe even efforts for a more concerted New York Rye Month that we can involve retailers and bars and restaurants to, frankly, further help us promote the types of efforts we're putting forth. And as the numbers increase, I think that only will develop a greater enthusiasm and hopefully broader spectrum of what people are tasting from New York rye whiskey as well.
And we actually, I'll mention that we actually have, I need to update that website. There's another 2 distilleries. So the total is actually 9. So there's another 2 distilleries that have confirmed that they've put rye, Empire Rye compliant liquid in oak. And so in 2 years, we'll have, 9 additional distilleries. And because I like to kind of occasionally be an enfant terrible and throw some controversy out into the world, I will say this is kind of a cheeky comment, but in terms of sheer buy-in to the category as a concept, Empire Rye is now more legitimate than Tennessee whiskey is, in the sense that, there's we have 3 distilleries in Tennessee making Tennessee whiskey, and we now have, we have 7 plus another 9 coming in New York State making Empire Rye. So we're a bigger category than Tennessee whiskey already. Now, given Jack Daniel's daily output,
I was about to say, it was
more than all of us made together in a year. But just in terms of the number of distilleries that do it, we're bigger than Tennessee whiskey. I'll also note, and this is our pride in Nicole Austin, who was instrumental in the development of Empire Rye, who was involved in that debate. She used to be the master blender at Kings County Distilling in Brooklyn, and she just got called up to be the head distiller and manager of what used to be called the Dickel Distillery, now Cascade Hollow. So an Empire Rye founder now trying to buoy up Tennessee whiskey.
There we go. So there's other roads ahead for possibly everyone then, right?
Well, all I'm saying is look to New York.
There you go. And so there was another question that kind of rolled in, and they quite want to know, like Frank said, is there a different taste profile that's coming out of New York rye that you can't get out of Empire Rye that you can't get out of other ryes that are on the market today? Is there just something that's different, the taste profile, or is it really like a thing of, hooray, pride New York, that sort of thing? Like what's the...
I'd look at a couple things. One is, again, different than bourbon, where there may be virtually no bourbons that are 51% rye. There are 51% corn on the bourbon side. On the rye side, the preservation of rye as a category has really, up until recently, been left to the major players out of Kentucky. Hands down, they make fantastic whiskey. But to a brand, almost all of them are actually 51% rye. So there's a few little substrates here. Most of the ryes, and frankly, yes, not just coming out of New York, but out of craft distilleries in different parts of the country, most of these ryes are looking for different profiles, something that harkens back to whether it's an authentic age from the colonial era or post, but also, again, what might be inherent to the ryes grown in our region. So as you heard from all of us, just whether it's the Empire Rye set at a minimum of 75% in the mash bill or higher, that in and of itself is pretty unique in this day and age. For us, again, it depends on the specific variety of the grain, but we are finding some interesting tropical notes that are coming, between 2, 3, and 4-year-old rye whiskeys that I think is something we're going to try and expand on and in the most positive ways exploit if we can.
Well, awesome. Last question coming from Jan. By the way, Jan is very excited because there's 3 distilleries within 20 minutes. Are these distillery only releases, or what's the distribution right now that you can find available?
Yeah.
Well, again, everybody's kind of doing it in a different way. So some of us might have their standard whiskey, like for instance, our Mackenzie Rye will be an Empire Rye whiskey, and it's widely distributed. But there may be others that are in the business of distilling brandy, and they just want to make an Empire Rye for their tasting room. So it's gonna vary.
Our Ragtime Rye with the Applejack finish, again, our qualifying Empire Rye, is available in about 40 stores around New York City. It's also available at our distillery. On our end, it's just a matter of how much we can make. So it is a limited time offering that we'll offer seasonally. Right now, our plans are annually between September and March.
Copper C's Bonnecue Crag straight rye malt is, that's our flagship product now. We pretty much went all in and is widely available where fine spirits are sold in the New York market. But then, I'm aware of several of the other distilleries who are pushing to produce more of it, to make it a regular offering. And then some others are again, just putting their toe in the water, sort of, they want to be involved and they want to see how it goes, but don't necessarily. A lot of these guys are also just making a really good rye already. And I encourage people to drink New York ryes of any stripe, whether it's an Empire Rye or not, because they're all pretty excellent. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. But people are super excited about it. I mean, what's also fun for me is I go do market work down in the city, and I think my partner, the CEO of our company, kind of gives me guff about it sometimes when he hears me doing it. But I'll sit there and talk. I'll sit there and try to sell somebody a bottle of Mackenzie Rye or a bottle of Ragtime Rye, because what I'm saying is
we do the same.
I'm like, do a flight. Here's the power of this concept. Don't just buy mine in. Buy in at least 2 or 3 other examples, so that you can get people excited about it. And those who have done it have already gotten back to us about how successful it is. So,
well, awesome. I think that's a good way to kind of wrap this up, is that you need to try everybody's to make sure you can really have a very way of tasting everything, whether it's coming from Brooklyn or other different parts of New York, right? So that's definitely awesome. So I want to give you guys one last opportunity, just quickly, to kind of say who you are, what you represent, and how they can get in contact with you. Brian, go ahead first.
So again, Brian McKenzie, the owner of Finger Lakes Distilling here on Seneca Lake in upstate New York. Our flagship products are Mackenzie whiskeys, bourbon and rye. You can find us at our website, fingerlakesdistilling.com, as well as through all the social media channels. Thanks again for the opportunity.
You got it. Alan
Katz with New York Distilling Company here in Brooklyn, and our rye whiskey offerings are Ragtime Rye and Ragtime Rye with the Applejack barrel finish. And you can find us at nydistilling.com. And I'd say keep an eye out for Rye Week and Rye Month activities in October, both on the Empire Rye website, and I'm sure at all of our colleagues as well.
And I'm Christopher Williams, Chief Distiller at Copper Sea Distilling. We are in Ulster County, in the heart of the Hudson Valley, God's own country. And we make Bonnecue Crag straight rye malt, which is our Empire Rye. And please check out the EmpireRye.com website and Copper Sea if you want to get in touch with me. Christopher at coppersea.com if you want to email me. Happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Well, fellas, thank you again. Make sure you're following all these people on social media. Make sure you definitely check out EmpireRye.com, and you can get a little bit more information on the standards. These gentlemen, their distilleries, as well as the other committed distillers that are coming up and through with inside of New York, and you can get a little bit more idea about that. Make sure you're following us as well, Bourbon Pursuit, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you hear, big support the podcast, patreon.com, patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit. And you can have the opportunity to join in and ask questions, as you just heard today from our Patreon members. So it was great discussion. If you have any other show suggestions, people you want to see, topics you want to hear about, fan mail, hate mail, whatever it is, the duo at bourbonpursuit.com. With that, gentlemen, thank you again for joining, and we will see everyone next week.